Hello everyone, Sam here, and today we're going to be talking about the Lone Ranger magazine. This was a pulp magazine published in 1937, and this is the second issue that was published in May of 1937. The Lone Ranger pulp magazine was actually not a very long-running publication. It only ran for a couple of issues, running from April to November of 1937. And despite the fact that the Lone Ranger was absolutely huge at the time, for some reason this only went for about 7 issues. Let's see, May, June, July, over. I'm sorry, 8 issues. This was not a very long publication, which is strange because the Lone Ranger was not only a big character, but this was after the explosion of pulp heroes that had started with The Shadow. So you would think that the Lone Ranger would have caught this wave in the pulp magazines, but he just didn't for some reason, and so this series only lasted those 8 issues. And the publisher that put out this publication was Trojan Publishing. They also went by the name of Culture Publishing. And that's kind of funny considering Trojan Publishing was actually somewhat more known for more saucy publications like spicy mystery stories, and also their later tamer follow-ups like Speed and Snappy stories. So that's kind of an unusual publisher choice for a character like the Lone Ranger, who was a much more child-friendly and adolescent-friendly character, and the spicy mystery stories in their ilk were very much not aimed at younger readers. But this series came out 4 years after the Lone Ranger had premiered on radio in 1933. And of course, that was a big hit at the time, and it was still going strong at the time this pulp magazine came out. So it makes sense why they would make a pulp magazine out of the Lone Ranger, given his popularity. And yeah, so this sort of seemed inevitable, like I said, because the pulp hero explosion had happened. The Lone Ranger is hugely popular. Pulp magazines are still popular. So it makes sense why this popped up in 1937. For those who don't know who the Lone Ranger is, which I find unlikely because even if you don't know who the Lone Ranger is, you've seen someone or something reference him. The Lone Ranger was a man whose name sometimes varies on the iteration, but his last name is Reed. And he was a Texas Ranger who was part of this posse that went out to catch a criminal called Butch Cavendish. But Butch Cavendish ambushed the Rangers, and all of them died except Reed. And Reed was helped out by an Indian named Tonto. And instead of going back to civilization and letting people know he was alive, Reed decided, okay, I'm going to put on the mask, and even dug a fake grave for himself. And he decided to call himself the Lone Ranger, since he was the only Ranger who survived the attack. So he put on the mask. He went and got brought Butch Cavendish to justice. But he decided to continue his crusade with Tonto, and he kept the mask on, and he worked with Tonto to fight all the injustice in the Wild West that he came across. And he also rode a horse named Silver, who was a very beautiful white horse, very distinctive. And he also used silver bullets. And the Lone Ranger was a very squeaky clean character. Like, he virtually never killed anybody. When he did, it was very rare. He was the most classic white hat cowboy hero character. He always shot the guns out of people's hands. He generally tried not to kill anybody. He always made sure to do things as cleanly as possible. So he was a squeaky, probably the squeakiest clean Western hero besides like maybe Roy Rogers. Because like I said, he was generally aimed more at children and adolescents. So that was the Lone Ranger's general history, and that's what his history's generally been from this point forward. So I actually got this book last year at Pulp Fest, most because I saw it on some vendor's table, and I was like, oh, I didn't know the Lone Ranger had a Pulp magazine. So I was like, well, let me get this issue, see how I feel about it, see if I want to check it out, any of the rest of the series. And this was republished by Adventure House, the Pulp publisher, Adventure House. And I actually checked their website. They have the complete series reprinted in this format. Because it doesn't just reprint the stories, it actually keeps the exact same formatting as the original Pulp magazine did. So that's very cool. And yeah, I didn't watch a whole lot of Lone Ranger growing up, but my father did, because he was born in the 1950s when the Clayton Moore TV show with the Lone Ranger was on. So I was quite aware of him growing up. My dad would occasionally watch reruns with him. My dad listened to the Lone Ranger radio show when he was when he was working for the United States Army over in West Germany. So he was very familiar with the character, and that's how I kind of gleaned what I know about him, the Lone Ranger character, from him. So this was kind of interesting to read and see how the character was at this point in his history. Because, like I said, remember, this was only 4 years after he premiered, so the TV show hasn't shown up. None of the Lone Ranger movies have appeared. So he's still a pretty new character at this point in his history. Before I talk about what works and what doesn't work in the story, I first want to give some brief descriptions of what the stories in here are. Now, it might be a little hard for you guys to read, but the title story for the Lone Ranger is The Masked Rider's Justice. And this is a story where the Lone Ranger goes into a western town and saves this young man from a lynching party, because the Lone Ranger knows that the boy was framed for murder. And the story is him trying to find the real culprit. And not just find the real culprit, but provide enough evidence to exonerate the boy, because he knows the lynchers will still go after him even if the Lone Ranger finds the real killer. So that's the main story in this book. And there are 3 short stories. One is Dust Devils, which is about this young teenager who works on a ranch right after he learns that his father's killers are on the neighboring ranch. So there's a little bit of a conflict there. There's also the 3-in-1 Lawman, where there's this portly sheriff who's trying to keep the peace in this western town, but there's a bunch of shady, prominent citizens of the town that want to oust him from his position. And he's called the 3-in-1 lawman because he's the sheriff, the coroner, and the justice of the peace. And so it's kind of this recurring gag of how he talks to himself, because since he's the sheriff and also the judge, he acts like he's talking to someone else when he's just talking to himself. So that's why he's the 3-in-1 lawman. And the final short story is The Marshal of Frozen Cat. And it's this sort of comedic story where there's these cowpokes who are working near this town, and they're trying to get thrown into the local jail. Because it turns out the local marshal is a woman, and she's also the cook that makes the prison food, and it's fantastic prison food. So these cowpokes that are stuck eating, beans and bacon for months at a time decide, let's commit some minor crimes to try and get that good jail food. But those are the short stories. There's also some nonfiction pieces in here. One is the second part of a 3-part nonfiction narrative about the Western gunfighter John Wesley Hardin. It says in here that it's the second part. The first part was in the April edition, and supposedly the third part is in the June issue of this magazine. There's also a brief narrative about the Battle of Beecher Island, which was a frontier battle between frontiersmen and Indians on the Colorado and Kansas border. And there's also and it's called the Battle of Beecher Island because the frontiersmen got on this island in the middle of the river separating that area of Colorado from Kansas, and that's where they hold up to hold off the Cheyenne that were attacking them. There's also this nonfiction piece that describes how cattle are loaded up for market at a train yard. And there's also a brief description, like a very short thing showing this narrative about how Billy the Kid, the infamous outlaw, actually helped some poor guy out once who was sick. So those are the nonfiction pieces. There's also a comedy comic in here featuring a goofy deputy named Doodlebug Jones. And Doodlebug Jones is trying to kill the skunk, which is this little skunk that's running around. And then other outlaws come in, and goofiness reigns supreme. There's also this letters to the editor section that is done by Pop Bonner, an old cowboy cook who ran the chuck wagon. Obviously it's not. It's somebody on the editorial staff, but that's who Pop Bonner supposedly is. And the whole thing about it is that he answers questions from the readers in a stereotypical cowboy accent, which is written out, how a cowboy talks. So, and at the very end, there's also this brief article talking about stamps, because stamp collecting was big at this time. And there's also a quiz for those kids that are in the Lone Ranger fan club. You fill out the answers to your quiz and send it in, and you get some sort of prize. So, a lot of material in this one magazine, a lot of it different materials. So, that was kind of interesting to see how much a wide variety of materials in here besides the main Lone Ranger story. So, about what works in this magazine, kind of what I just said about the variety of materials in this magazine, because it's not just the Lone Ranger and a bunch of other fiction stories. There's some nonfiction stuff. There's some fan interaction material. Uh, it's something that I could see kids really enjoying because it has a really wide breadth of material that I'm sure some kid in the 30s probably enjoyed. So, uh, this is this really lives up to the idea of it being a magazine. There's not just one thing going on in it. There's multiple things. So that's very cool. And like I said, I really enjoy that Adventure House kept the formatting for the old Pulp magazine. They didn't just reprint the words, they actually kept the formatting and the pictures and the spacing. So that was very cool. In regards to the Lone Ranger story, I actually like that it was fairly accurate to the character. Like everything in there really felt accurate to how the Lone Ranger generally acts. And yeah, I was checking it because I was like, I don't remember an author being listed here, and there's not. No authors listed for the Lone Ranger story. Part of me wonders if maybe they took it from a radio script, because there would have been plenty of radio scripts by this time, and maybe they turned it into a longer piece. That could be one reason why it's so accurate. And that had been done before for other comic characters. I say comic, but I have heard of that being done with pulp characters who adapted the comics. Maybe it could have happened with radio characters adapted to pulp magazines. Might have happened. But it does feel like a legitimate Lone Ranger story. It doesn't feel out of place. The two of the short stories that I mentioned, 3-in-1 Lawman and Marshall Frozen Cat, they're pretty good because they both are kind of these comedic stories showing these these different law enforcement officials and sort of their strange quirks and the different reactions the townsfolk have towards them. The 3-in-1 Lawman is definitely more serious because there is a serious crime, and the kookiness of the sheriff talking to himself is more just like a side element. It's not the main focus. But Marshall Frozen Cat is very much meant to be a comedy, and I think they're both very effective in what they do. They do have 3-in-1 Lawman is a strong Western tale with an inkling of comedy, and Marshall Frozen Cat is just a straight comedy with a pretty good punchline in the end. So those were very fun to read. I also think the nonfiction pieces are generally pretty good, like the one with John Wesley Hardin, the Battle of Beecher Island, the mechanics of loading meat to on trains to market. They really highlight the interesting history of the West. They both show the history of West with John Wesley Hardin and the Battle of Beecher Island. But then they also have something that is that was still going on in the present, loading cattle up for market. And so it's kind of interesting that they sort of highlight this thing of like, yeah, this loading up cattle for market, it is still done today, and by today I mean in 1937 when this was written, and kind of showing how the Western heritage was still around at the time. So those nonfiction pieces are very strong. And I also kind of like the stuff in the back end that has all the stuff related to all the fans who are reading, from Pop Bonner's reactions to them to the stuff about the stamps and the fan quiz. It's just something that shows like, oh yeah, the publishers of this were paying a lot of attention to what the readers were interested in, and definitely trying to engage with the fans and keep that engagement going. So that's very cool to see that this was back when they were really trying to make sure the kids were invested. That was a that's just something really neat. It's like we always kind of think of like, oh, fandoms didn't really come into existence until like maybe the 60s, but no, this shows that there were plenty of fan clubs and committees going on even in the 30s. So that's very cool to see in this recreation of the Pulp magazine. So to talk about what doesn't work with this issue of the Lone Ranger, I said Masked Rider's Justice feels like a legit Lone Ranger story, but a major issue I had with it is that it feels very drawn out, because it's a story where it feels like it could be 5 or 6 chapters, but for some reason it's 10. Like there's a lot of extraneous stuff that's piled on to make it sort of a full-length story. Because let's see, it was 60. It was about 60 pages, and I would say about 25 of them are not needed. There's just a lot of filler going on. And it's not necessarily that nothing is happening, it's more that whoever's writing the story is like explaining every single small detail about everything that happens, and it just sort of takes the gumption out of the story. That's why I was also wondering if maybe it was an adapted radio script, because it really kind of felt like, oh yeah, this could work as a radio script, but the radio script would be done in about 20 to 25 minutes. This takes much longer to read and get that done. So the pacing was a little too sluggish in the story. The one short story, Dust Devils, that's the one short story I think doesn't entirely work, because the whole concept of it is that this young rancher boy finally gets a job as ranching, and then he learns the evil ranchers who killed his father are in the neighboring ranch. And it starts off with like this really cool premise of like, well, you know, what's he gonna do about it? Is he gonna do revenge? Is he gonna alert the sheriff? But about halfway through, it kind of drops that thing, and it essentially he just waits for the other ranchers to do something shady, and then he's able to pew pew them. And it's kind of like, it felt like the writer had like this cool concept for a story. Like, what do you do when the bad guys that you've hated all your life are right next to you? But it kind of feels like it ran out of steam about a quarter of the way through the story, and the writer just didn't really know what to do. And so he just went, okay, they attacked the ranch, they tried to sneak in. It's like, yeah, it kind of takes the central character focus of that young boy, where you think, okay, that's going to be the main focus, and sort of see how he reacts to the situation. But no, the bad guys have to come in and start something before he really does anything. So it just kind of feels like a story with a strong concept that just doesn't live up to what it's trying to do. I mentioned the Doodlebug Jones comic. That's like 2 or 3 pages, and it's in one ear, out the other. It's like he's having a goofy rivalry with a skunk. Then like other outlaws show up, and the skunk, you know, decides to help him fight off these outlaws. And it's kind of like, it's the most basic Western comedic sort of thing, or it's like, oh, and they're all talking exaggerated cowboy accents. It's kind of like, yeah, it's just such a lowest common denominator thing because of course you gotta have a stinky skunk. It's like that. It's not just that it's, and yeah, I get it. The Lone Ranger magazine's written for kids, but again, that it does not feel like something the Lone Ranger would do. Like a lot of kids like the Lone Ranger because there was a little bit of grit to him. I mean, he is still shooting guns at people, but that whole thing of the skunk just kind of, it's not just boring. It's just a little too goofy for its own good. So yeah, that didn't do anything for me. Uh, the Pop Bonner stuff. The Pop Bonner is what is the persona the editor takes on when he's answering the reader's questions. That one really bothered me because he was writing the whole thing in a stereotypical cowboy accent. Uh, and it's that annoying kind where all the words are cut short, and you have to read the words sort of one by one, because if you don't read it carefully, you might mistake what he's reading because they write it so obtusely. Like here's the first line. Well, folks, here we air again, all squatting round the old chuck wagon and ready to hear the cookie's grand old yowl. Come and get it. Ain't no sound on the cow range. What brings fellas and gals a rompin' at a run like that one? And you know, instead of saying R-A-R-E, it's A-I-R. Like, it's just very obtuse to read. And actually, it makes it kind of hard to get what he's saying, because you're basically trying to say, okay, what is it? Let me read this out very slowly so I know what's happening. And as someone who's somewhat of a fast reader, that's very irritating to me. And it actually goes back to something one of my writing teachers taught me in college, which was, they said, barring very extraordinary circumstances, they said, never write your character's accent out. For the simple reason that they explained it. It becomes a pain to read, and when people are more focused on, like, actually reading the individual words, sometimes they don't really take in the story, the things you're trying to say in the story, because they're so focused on figuring out, okay, what is this character actually saying? And the writing teachers heavily emphasize, okay, find different ways that you can show who's talking through sort of these quirky tells. Like have somebody have a certain phrase or have a certain style of speak that you don't necessarily have to write out phonetically. That you can just say it, and the reader, by supposition, will be able to figure out who's saying it. Writing out the accent, no, they always said don't do that, because when somebody because it essentially turns into like when you're reading something in another language and you're trying to learn that language, and when you're initially reading for your second language, you're more so trying to decipher what the words mean than what the actual sentence means. And my mother told me, yeah, when you learn a second language, you're able to put together what all the words together mean right off the bat. But when you're first reading for a second language, you're just looking at the individual words. That's kind of what was going on with Pop Bonner. They write so obtusely that I'm just like, this is becoming hard to read. I'm becoming less interested in what Pop has to say. So that was kind of irritating. So final ranking. Uh, I rank on a 5-star system, 0 out of 5 being the worst, 5 out of 5 being the best. And I would say that the Lone Ranger magazine, the May issue, is a solid 3 out of 5 stars, which is pleasantly average in my ranking parlance. Because none of the stories are necessarily great. Like, none of these, like, really caught me. The only one that I think fully works is Marshall Frozen Cat, because that's a pretty straightforward comedic tale. Every other story I kind of have issues with. But on the whole, I think the main story does a good job at capturing the Lone Ranger's tone and his appeal. And I think the rest of the stories do a good job at capturing that appeal that the Lone Ranger had towards the primarily child audience of the day. Like, a lot of the stuff in here definitely feels like it's aimed more at kids, but in like a fun way. You know, it's not done in a way that like feels too dumbed down, aside from maybe that Doodlebug Jones, excuse me, aside from that Doodlebug Jones comic, but yeah, I would definitely recommend this if you're a Lone Ranger fan. And I would actually recommend to anyone who wants like sort of a lighter western reading. You know, westerns that are not as violent or hardcore. There is some violence in here, like in those short stories. A fair number of people do get their ticket, but yeah, this is would probably be fine for people who are into like lighter westerns. Any inspiration? For those that don't know, I'm a working writer, and whenever I do these reviews, I like to talk about whether whatever I've read has inspired me in any way with my own writing. And the one story in here that did kind of inspire me was the Marshall Frozen Cat, because I really like the idea of a female marshal who has to deal with a lot of criminals, but not necessarily because of the typical criminal behavior that bad guys are doing, but because the men are just so attracted to her and her abilities that they want to get close to her and hope to woo her or get something from her. That's kind of a funny idea. I'm like, okay, that could actually be a good comedic story, because in this version, it's only like 3 or 4 pages. It's not a very long story, but I think there's definitely something you could play off there. With in my own writing, I think there's kind of an interesting idea there of wanting attention from law enforcement for not necessarily criminal reasons, but romantic reasons. So that could be an interesting story. Well, that's all I really have to say about the Lone Ranger in this particular magazine. I'll probably be doing another Lone Ranger story because I actually had one from Moonstone Books. They did the Lone Ranger for a while, and I'll probably review that sometime in the coming months. I'm not sure if I'll get the rest of the magazine issues of the Lone Ranger that Adventure House put out, simply because I was kind of like, I'm reading this and, like, yeah, it's fine, but it is a thing that it does feel definitely aimed more at a younger audience. So it's one of those things I'm like, okay, it's going to be these kinds of stories that, aren't bad, but they're not generally my thing. So I may or may not check out the other issues. We shall see. But I will be talking about the Lone Ranger sometime in the future, so he will be talked about again. So, yeah, that's where I'm going to end it, and I will catch everybody later, and I guess I'll close this with a Hi-Yo Silver away.